the costs of doing business with the United States will drastically increase. And what is more, there seems to be no order in the disorder.
Well, Dave Keating then joins us from Brussels. Dave, a pretty strong reaction from there then.
There were strong words in that video statement put out by President von der Leyen early this morning, but there wasn't any new action. She didn't say that the EU is going to move forward with any new retaliatory tariffs. Instead, they are going to continue trying to negotiate. And she said that the commissioner in charge of trade, Maroš Šefčovič, is in, quote, permanent dialogue with the United States to try to negotiate a way out of this. According to what I've heard, the U.S. is basically ignoring him, so that seems like more of a permanent monologue than a permanent dialogue. But she did address citizens' frustration, I think, when they hear the news. Despite her strong words, the news of that video statement this morning is going to be the EU is not retaliating for the moment. And she said a lot of EU citizens are going to be frustrated with the actions of, quote, America's oldest ally, Europe's oldest ally. However, I think there's a wait-and-see approach here because there are hopes that they can get that 20% figure down to the 10% that applies across the board to everyone and is applying, for instance, to the UK. The thing is, even at 10%, they probably have to retaliate, but they don't have to retaliate as much. But, you know, I've already heard this morning some huge frustration from people here in Brussels. One EU official who's not directly involved in trade talks said, you know, it would be ridiculous if the EU, which is a larger market than the United States, despite Trump saying the opposite last night, it would be ridiculous for the EU not to be responding forcefully, while tiny Canada, which is so much more vulnerable, is showing more courage and is retaliating. So there is a will here to move. I think that things will change next week once these tariffs actually get applied, particularly if the 20% tariff gets applied on the European Union next week. We're probably, for sure, moving forward with the 26 billion euro package that was already proposed in response to Trump's global tariffs on steel and aluminium. The question is whether the EU then goes the next step with further retaliatory tariffs.
Yeah, obviously a lot of talking going on behind the scenes, Dave. Just while you're talking there, we're just hearing, in fact, the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, cancelling all engagements for the day to focus on actions to take in response to US tariffs. Kedevan is still with me here. Kedevan, what is Donald Trump actually trying to achieve here?
Well, look, there is one aspect of it, which is retaliation. Donald Trump has been basically obsessed with the idea of tariffs through much of his career, even before he was into politics, but even more so since he's gone into U.S. politics. And one example of that is, of course, the European Union, where he has said that the EU was basically created to rip off the United States. But he said it again yesterday, saying that for decades our country has been looted, pillaged, raped, plundered by nations near and far, both friend and foe alike. So the main aspect of these tariffs is this idea of revenge, of retaliation, to respond to what he sees as the bad treatment of the United States by these countries. But that's not the only reason why he's doing this. There's also an aspect of this that is a negotiating tactic, to put pressure on other countries to obtain something out of them. Some of it is to obtain, for example, lower tariffs from these other countries, pressure them into lowering their tariffs. But it's also things that have nothing to do with trade. We saw it with immigration, for example, on smaller countries in Latin America, where he was pressuring them with tariffs, saying you need to do more about immigration, either taking in the people that we're deporting or making better control of your border with us, like with Mexico. There was also the question of the flow of fentanyl. That's true for Mexico, for Canada, for China. So it's not just a trade issue per se, but it is a negotiating tactic. Then you have what he's trying to sell as the goals domestically, which is raising revenue. He has been saying that this is going to bring billions of dollars into the United States, and that could potentially be a way to pay off some of the tax cuts that Donald Trump wants to possibly implement in the near future during his term. And finally, what he's been trying to say to the American people is that this is short-term pain for long-term gain, meaning that he believes that this is going to revive U.S. manufacturing by making it so expensive to import products in the United States that either companies that went abroad will come back or decide to move to the United States. The problem with all of these goals is that they don't always coexist well, because if your goal is to bring in revenue in the long term or to make companies come back, then you can't possibly lift those tariffs in the next 2 months. But if it's a negotiating tactic, or if you're trying to extort something out of other countries, then you need to actually show that you're willing to lift these tariffs. So he's putting out there a lot of reasons why these tariffs are a good thing for the United States, but they don't always apply in reality. There are some of them that are really short-term fixes or short-term resolutions, and others that need the long-term in order to be successful.
Well, let's end by going back to you, Dave, there in Brussels. Look towards the future. As you said there, the EU could respond next week, Dave. Von der Leyen saying the EU has many cards to play if it chooses to, but what are those cards?
Yeah, the EU has a lot of tools in its tool belt that it can use, and von der Leyen said that when she spoke to the European Parliament on Tuesday. And legally, Commission officials are pretty confident that they are in the right here, that it would be legally sound to be striking back because these tariffs are arbitrary. That's why they keep using that word. It's not an accident. That word allows them to retaliate. And, they're saying that the figures in the chart that Trump showed yesterday, saying that the U.S. is applying half the tariffs that these other jurisdictions do, seem to have been pulled out of thin air. For instance, he said that the EU applies tariffs of 39% on U.S. imports. The actual figure is between 1% and 3%. Now, they're saying that they're calculating the non-tariff barriers in that, but they won't release their homework there. They won't actually say how they arrived at the calculation. And this morning, economists are saying it looks like they're actually calculating the trade deficit, which is not a tariff in any way. So the EU has grounds here to say this is arbitrary, but they also have a nuclear option, and that's targeting U.S. services. There is a trade deficit for goods. The EU exports way, way more goods to the U.S. than the other way around. But in services, it's the reverse. The EU imports way more U.S. services than it exports to the United States. And if the EU decides to hit those services with retaliatory tariffs, it could devastate big companies. Now, what are we talking about with services? We're talking about banking. We're talking about financial services. We're also talking about big tech, the companies that really dominate the technological landscape here in the European Union. Basically anything that's not a tangible good. Those have never been tariffed before, and it's obviously more tricky to tariff something that you can't hold in your hand than something that's a physical good. But von der Leyen mentioned services in her speech to the Parliament on Tuesday. They are considering that. That would be a pretty big escalation. So as I say, I don't even think we would see that coming next week. They're holding that for now, but that could devastate U.S. banks, U.S. big tech companies, if the EU decides to pull that lever.
All to watch then. Dave, thanks very much. Dave Keating joining us there from Brussels, and here in the studio, Katavan Gorgistani, International Affairs Editor.